right to protest meets the right time to protest. Right. Before we dive into what might be the most contentious political moment in recent memory, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to unpack is a kind of political tightrope walking that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about British democracy. And trust me, you'll want to be here for the fallout. So here's the setup. It's October 7th, 2025. 2 years to the day since Hamas launched an attack on Israel that left nearly 1,200 people dead, scores injured, and families shattered. A date seared into collective memory. A date of mourning. And yet, across British universities and city centres, pro-Palestinian activists are planning protests. Not just any protests, mind you, but rallies with titles like 2 years of genocide, 2 years of resistance, and vigils to honor our martyrs. The stage is set for a collision between grief and activism, between the right to protest and the question of whether exercising that right is, well, right. Enter Sir Keir Starmer. Our Prime Minister, ever the former human rights lawyer turned political pragmatist, has now waded into waters so murky they make the Thames look crystalline. His message? Just because you can protest doesn't mean you should. Let that sink in for a moment. The leader of a nation built on the principles of free expression and democratic protest is telling citizens that having the freedom to do something doesn't necessarily mean it's appropriate to do it. It's like being told you have a right to remain silent, but perhaps you really ought to consider using it. Now, Starmer's spokesman didn't mince words. He implored protesters to show humanity and remember the heinous terrorist attacks. The Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, had already pleaded for at least a few days of respite to allow the Jewish community time to grieve. But here's where it gets properly sticky. Over 1,000 protesters showed up in London that very weekend anyway. Nearly 500 were arrested in central London for expressing support for Palestine Action, a proscribed terrorist organization. Banners were unfurled over Westminster Bridge. Chants of "Long live the Intifada" echoed outside number 10 Downing Street. The very heart of British government became a stage for what the Prime Minister's spokesman later described as not British and not patriotic. Let's pause there. Not British. Not patriotic. These are loaded terms, aren't they? Because what could be more British than the right to protest? We're the country of the suffragettes, of the Chartists, of people who historically took to the streets when they believed power needed challenging. Protest is woven into the fabric of British identity. And yet here we are, with the government effectively saying there's a Britishness test for activism, that some protests pass muster than others. Well, they are beyond the pale. But here's the thing that makes the situation so devastatingly complex. Context matters. Timing matters. The Jewish community, still reeling from a terror attack on a Manchester synagogue just days earlier during Yom Kippur, is asking for space to grieve. Community leaders, police chiefs, and politicians across the spectrum have called for these particular protests to be postponed. Not cancelled. Not banned. Just moved. A gesture of respect for a community experiencing collective trauma. Is that censorship or is it compassion? The protesters would say they're exercising their democratic rights, that the situation in Gaza demands constant attention, that silence is complicity. They'd point out that the universities hosting these events have every right to facilitate political discourse. Queen Mary University, King's College, Strathclyde, Sheffield, Birmingham, Goldsmiths, these are institutions built on the principle of free inquiry and expression. One group at the University of Sheffield even refused to reschedule because they'd already printed their posters. Let that detail marinate for a second. The cost of reprinting materials outweighed the consideration of timing. Meanwhile, the government is performing a delicate dance. They can't ban the protests outright without looking authoritarian. Britain isn't about to start shutting down lawful assembly, no matter how uncomfortable it makes Downing Street. But they can apply pressure, moral pressure, political pressure, the kind of pressure that comes from a Prime Minister spokesman standing at a podium and essentially saying, "We're not stopping you, but we're deeply disappointed in you." It's very British, actually, very passive-aggressive, very "I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed." But let's talk about what Starmer is really grappling with here. He's trying to hold together a country that's increasingly fractured along lines of identity, belief, and historical grievance. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict isn't happening over there anymore. It's playing out in British streets, on British campuses, in British communities. Every flare-up in the Middle East sends ripples through constituencies here. Jewish communities feel unsafe. Muslim communities feel unheard. Everyone's got skin in this game now, and the Prime Minister is stuck trying to referee a match where both sides believe they are playing different sports entirely. And here's where Starmer's legal background becomes both asset and liability. As a human rights lawyer, he knows exactly what the law says about freedom of assembly. He knows protesters have rights. But as Prime Minister, he also knows that laws don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the messy reality of human emotion, communal trauma, and political optics. He can't be seen as weak on terrorism, hence the crackdown on Palestine Action supporters. But he also can't be seen as suppressing legitimate political expression, hence the carefully worded statements about humanity rather than outright bans. The universities themselves are caught in the crossfire. They are supposed to be bastions of free speech, places where controversial ideas get aired and debated. But they are also responsible for the safety and well-being of their students. When Jewish students say they feel threatened by rallies that use language like martyrs and resistance on the anniversary of a massacre, what's a university to do? Cancel the event and face accusations of censorship? Let it proceed and face accusations of enabling antisemitism? There's no winning move here, only degrees of losing. And then there's the broader question that nobody really wants to touch. What makes a protest legitimate? Is it the cause? The timing? The language used? The behavior of participants? Because if we're honest, the British establishment has a long history of telling people when and how they are allowed to be angry. The suffragettes were told they were being too disruptive. The miners were told they were being too political. Every major social movement has faced some version of yes, but not like that, and certainly not now. So when Starmer says people should demonstrate humanity, what he's really saying is please read the room. Please understand that your right to protest doesn't exist in isolation from other people's right to grieve. Please consider whether making your point today, on this specific date, is worth the pain it causes others. It's an appeal to something beyond law, beyond rights. It's an appeal to basic human decency and social cohesion. But protesters would counter that grieving and protesting aren't mutually exclusive, that they are mourning too, mourning the thousands dead in Gaza, mourning what they see as an ongoing genocide. From their perspective, every day that passes without protest is a day of complicity. They'd argue that asking them to postpone is asking them to prioritize one community's pain over another's. And in that framing, there's no good answer, just competing tragedies. This is what modern governance looks like in a pluralistic society. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. It requires threading needles that may not have thread holes. Starmer can't please everyone, so he's trying to displease everyone equally, which is perhaps the most democratic outcome possible even if it satisfies no one. The real question underneath all of this isn't about October 7th protests specifically. It's about how we live together in a country where people hold fundamentally incompatible views about fundamental issues, where one person's freedom fighter is another's terrorist, where historical grievances run so deep that every current event becomes refracted through them. Starmer's trying to manage that, and frankly, I'm not sure anyone could do it well. What we're witnessing is the limits of liberal democracy in real time, the tension between individual rights and collective responsibility, between free speech and social harmony, between the law as written and the law as lived, and there's no tidy resolution coming. This will keep happening. The next flashpoint is already forming somewhere on the horizon. So where does that leave us? With a Prime Minister asking protesters to show restraint they are not legally required to show, with communities talking past each other in different languages of trauma, with universities trying to balance impossible demands, and with all of us watching, trying to figure out where we stand in a landscape with no solid ground. That's it for today. The conversation doesn't end here, though, does it? It never does. So if you want to stay ahead of the next political earthquake, and trust me, there will be one, make sure you're subscribed. Because at UK Connors, we're not afraid to wade into the uncomfortable conversations. See you in the next one.